They say you'll always remember your wedding day, but no one tells you what to do when the groom never shows up. Not late. Not stuck in traffic. Not panicked or second-guessing. Just gone. As if the love he swore he had for you was a switch he flicked off overnight. My name is Amelia, and I was left standing at the altar in front of 200 people, with a heart full of promises that turned to ash. I should have seen it coming. The signs weren't small, they were just well disguised. Like the way Carter's eyes glazed over when I talked about my childhood. Or how every time I brought up our future he redirected to budgets and image. He didn't love me. He loved how I made him look. But love makes you blind, especially when you've never truly been seen. We met 4 years ago when I was working at a wedding, ironically. I was the event assistant, hauling chairs in heels and smiling through exhaustion. He was the best man. Smooth-talking. Tailored suit. The kind of man who made eye contact like a dare. He flirted. I deflected. He insisted. I caved. Within weeks I was swept into his world. Charity galas, weekend getaways, whispers of family businesses and legacy. He said I grounded him. Said I made him feel real. Said he'd never loved anyone like me. But here's the truth I learned too late. Some men love the idea of a woman more than the woman herself. They crave the story, the optics, but not the soul behind it. We got engaged after 2 years. A beach proposal with a hidden photographer. The video went viral. Strangers called us couple goals. Carter loved that. I thought it was sweet. Then. Now I realize he wasn't proposing to me, he was performing for them. The wedding planning was a whirlwind. He insisted on a luxury estate an hour outside the city. White stone walls, a chandeliered ballroom, rose gardens straight out of a movie. I didn't care about any of that, but he said it had to be perfect. I thought he meant for us. He meant for his image. The night before the wedding I barely slept. Not out of nerves, out of excitement. I loved him. Or at least I loved who I thought he was. That morning I slipped into my dress like armor. I told myself this was the beginning of forever. I stood at the altar, surrounded by flowers I couldn't afford but paid for anyway. Cameras flashed. Guests waited. And waited. 10 minutes turned into 20. Then one of the groomsmen walked up to me, his face pale, his hands shaking, and whispered something I'll never forget. He's not coming. First I thought it was a joke. A cruel prank. But then I looked at my mother's face. Then at his best man who couldn't even meet my eyes. The truth slammed into me like a wave I never saw coming. Carter had left. No goodbye. No explanation. Just vanished like our love had meant nothing. I didn't cry. Not then. I stood there in front of 200 guests and I smiled. Because when the whole world expects you to break, that's the most powerful moment to stay standing. The next hour after Carter's betrayal is a blur. A haze of whispers, pitying stares, and guests pretending not to judge while secretly feasting on the scandal. The silence in that grand wedding hall was louder than any scream. I remember standing still in my white dress, the silk suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. My mother approached, tears in her eyes, trying to pull me away from the altar, but I couldn't move. I was frozen. Paralyzed. Like if I stood there long enough, he'd show up and say it was all some twisted misunderstanding. But he didn't. Eventually, someone took the microphone and announced the wedding was cancelled. Just like that. 4 years of love, or whatever it was, erased in one sentence. My bridesmaids gathered around me like a shield, but I could see it in their eyes. Embarrassment. Pity. Even curiosity. Like they wanted to ask what I had done to drive him away. I didn't speak a word. Not that day. Not that night. I returned to the bridal suite, shut the door, and finally let the tears fall. Not pretty, dainty tears. The kind that shake your whole body. That make you question if your heart might actually crack open. I stared at myself in the mirror, makeup streaked, curls unraveling, and I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked defeated. Used. Like roadkill in a white dress. I stayed there until everyone left. Until even the staff had packed up the cake that would never be cut, the flowers that would wilt unclaimed. I sat on the couch in silence until the venue manager gently knocked and asked if I needed help getting home. I nodded numb. My mother tried to talk to me in the car, but I tuned her out. Her words were too soft, too careful, like she thought I might break apart completely. Maybe she was right. For days I didn't leave the house. I didn't eat. I didn't shower. The news had gotten out by then. Carter, the golden boy, had abandoned his fiancée at the altar. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't answer. Friends, coworkers, journalists, even influencers asking for statements to share my truth. I didn't want to share anything. I wanted to disappear. But somewhere between the tears and the silence, a different kind of pain took over. The kind that doesn't beg for pity, it demands purpose. Because once a woman has been humiliated on the biggest day of her life, there's only two choices: live in the shadow of it, or rise from it. So I got out of bed. I washed off the makeup that had become war paint. And I looked myself in the mirror and whispered, "This isn't how my story ends." But I didn't rush into revenge. That's not how real comebacks work. I started small. Cleaning. Running. Journaling. I needed to remember who I was before Carter walked into my life and convinced me I wasn't enough on my own. In those quiet days, I remembered the woman I used to be. The one who worked long hours planning events for other people, dreaming of the day she'd build something of her own. A woman who had ambition, ideas, drive. She hadn't died. She was just buried under years of trying to fit into Carter's perfect world. Then came the email. It was from the venue where I was supposed to get married. A courtesy follow-up from the event coordinator about final invoices, logistics, and the possibility of applying partial credits toward future bookings. I stared at the screen for a long time. That venue had been the scene of my most public humiliation. The place where I lost everything I thought I knew about love. But the thought struck me like lightning. What if that place could become something else? What if it became the beginning instead of the end? I didn't want my story to end with that altar. I wanted it to start there. And so I replied to the email. I asked to schedule a meeting, not as a former bride but as a potential investor. When I walked back into the venue, I wasn't a bride in white silk. I was a woman in a fitted blazer and black heels, sharp, steady, and sure of exactly who I was. The receptionist did a double take when she saw me. I could still hear the whisper in her eyes, "That's the girl he left." But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was here for a business meeting. The manager, Rebecca, greeted me with polite professionalism, but I noticed the tension behind her smile. She remembered the scene. Everyone did. "I have to say, Amelia," she began as we sat in her office, "I didn't expect to hear from you again." I offered a tight smile. Neither did I. But life's full of surprises. She tried to ease into small talk, but I cut straight to it. "I want to know if the venue's for sale. Or if it's struggling. Either way, I'm prepared to make an offer." Her face registered shock. I wasn't some billionaire heiress and she knew it. But I'd been doing my homework. This venue, while beautiful, had been struggling with overhead costs and dwindling bookings since the pandemic. My cancelled wedding had cost them a pretty penny in returns and press damage. And I had savings. I had time. But more than that, I had purpose. Rebecca hesitated. "Why this place? After what happened?" I looked her dead in the eye. "Because this is where everything fell apart. Which means it's also where everything starts over." That same week, I called my former mentor, a woman I once worked for in event planning who now consulted for upscale hospitality brands. I pitched my plan. A luxury venue that also functioned as a sanctuary for women-run businesses, workshops, retreats. Not just weddings. Not just champagne and roses. Real things. Healing things. He loved the concept. She offered to invest. Within 2 months, I signed the papers. And the venue? It was mine. The day I got the keys, I walked back into that same hall where I had once stood waiting for a man who never showed. But this time, I didn't wait for anyone. I walked straight down the aisle, alone, heels echoing against the marble. And when I reached the altar, I didn't cry. I smiled. Because this altar was no longer a symbol of abandonment. It was my empire's foundation. Renovations began immediately. I hired a new team, mostly women. Women who had been overlooked. Single moms. Fresh graduates. Women with passion and nowhere to put it. We repainted the walls, transformed the garden, upgraded the sound system. Every piece of the venue began to change just like me. But what no one expected was Carter's return. 3 months after the venue reopened under my ownership, he showed up. He walked in during a public networking event, looking sharp, still smug, wearing the same cologne I used to love. I saw him before he saw me. He scanned the crowd, probably expecting to be recognized, expecting me to freeze or stumble or maybe even throw a drink. Instead, I stood my ground. When our eyes met, his smirk faltered. He walked up slowly like he was approaching a memory. "Amelia," he said as if we were old friends. "Carter," I replied coolly, adjusting the mic on my dress. "I didn't expect to see you here." He glanced around. "Someone invited me. I didn't know you were involved." "I'm not just involved," I said. "I own the place." The color drained from his face. I didn't wait for him to respond. I stepped onto the stage, tapped the mic, and began my keynote speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "this venue has seen many stories. Some that ended in heartbreak. But today this space is about rebirth, reclamation, and rising higher than the people who tried to bury you." I didn't mention him. I didn't need to. Everyone in the room turned to look at Carter anyway. He left halfway through the speech. After Carter left that night, it was like the last thread connecting me to the version of myself that begged for closure was finally severed. I didn't feel triumphant in the way I thought I would. I didn't need his apology. I didn't crave his regret. I simply felt free. But freedom wasn't enough. I had a business to grow. And now that I was the owner of a place that once broke me, I was determined to turn it into a symbol of strength. Not just for me, but for every woman who had ever been discarded, underestimated, or made to feel small. Word began to spread. Not just about the venue's transformation, but about mine. Clients who had read my story in a bridal blog began booking with me, not just because the space was beautiful, but because it meant something now. It stood for something. I created a new brand for the venue, renamed it the Phoenix Room. Tagline: "Where endings become beginnings." We hosted our first community retreat for survivors of heartbreak and betrayal. Women came from all over the state. Some had called off weddings. Some had been left at the altar just like me. Some had walked away from marriages, toxic families, careers that drained them dry. And we sat together in that hall, the same hall where I once thought my life ended, and we rewrote what it meant to be left. We weren't abandoned. We were released. And release is where flight begins. From there, momentum exploded. I partnered with a wellness coach to offer grief-to-growth packages. Bookings tripled. The Phoenix Room wasn't just a venue, it was a movement. But karma wasn't finished writing her chapters yet. One afternoon, as I was reviewing bookings for the summer, my assistant knocked lightly on the office door. "You're not going to believe this," she said, eyes wide. She slid a booking form across the desk. It was a wedding. Carter's wedding. To the woman he left me for. They had booked the venue, under her name, probably thinking I wouldn't notice. I stared at the paper, heart still for a moment. Then I smiled. I approved the booking. No rage. No sabotage. No drama. I made sure my team gave them the best service. Top-tier packages, floral arrangements, the works. The same way I treat every client. Because this wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. My standards. My peace. But fate has a wicked sense of humor. 2 weeks before the wedding, the bride called in a panic. The guest list had leaked online. A scandal broke involving Carter's company and a lawsuit over embezzled funds. His face was splashed across the news. Sponsors pulled out. The wedding was postponed indefinitely. The Phoenix Room? Still booked solid. Still thriving. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't need to. The universe had taken care of that. I celebrated my growth. Months passed. My face appeared in Forbes Women and Entrepreneur Weekly. Invitations to speak poured in. I gave workshops on emotional resilience and business branding. I became a mentor to women who had stories like mine, some even more painful. And each time I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the girl in the white dress crying outside a church. I saw the woman in red lipstick and a silk blazer, standing behind the podium of a room she owned. I remember one night after closing up after an event, I stood in the main hall. The candles had burned low. The air was soft with silence. And I whispered to the room, "Thank you. Thank you for breaking me. Thank you for showing me I didn't need a perfect man or a perfect love story to matter. Thank you for reminding me that the real vows, the only ones that last, are the ones you make to yourself. To be whole. To rise. To never forget your worth again." And as I turned to leave, I didn't look back. Because the woman who once needed closure had already built something far more powerful than revenge. She built herself. It's strange how people always seem to find their way back when you no longer need them. Months after Carter's wedding fell apart, I received an email with no subject line. I almost deleted it thinking it was spam. But something made me click. It was from Carter. 4 sentences. I saw the article in Forbes. "Congratulations. I always knew you were capable of more than I could understand. I'm sorry for everything." No excuses. No explanations. Just a quiet acknowledgement of the woman he failed to see standing in front of him all those years ago. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. He had already written himself out of my story. My days became filled with purpose, not pain. I'd wake up early, do a gratitude meditation, and head to the venue, now booked months in advance. Each wedding, each retreat, each client reminded me that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And I was living proof that you could rebuild from ashes. Not as the same person but as someone stronger. One afternoon a young woman came in for a tour. She was soft-spoken, maybe 25. She glanced around nervously and held onto her bag like it anchored her. "I don't even know if I'm going through with the wedding," she said finally, tears threatening to spill. "But I came here because I heard this place changes people." I didn't sell her a package. I didn't offer brochures. I sat with her. Told her a little about the Phoenix Room and a little more about the version of myself I used to be. Not the CEO. Not the entrepreneur. The girl who once stood outside in a storm, heartbroken and humiliated, but still breathing. That woman thanked me with a hug. She didn't book her wedding. She canceled it. But she sent me an email later that night. I walked in thinking I needed a man to complete my story. I left realizing I had one to write all on my own. And in that moment I realized, this was never about Carter. It wasn't about the venue. It was about reclaiming the parts of ourselves that we gave away too easily. About learning that sometimes the heartbreak isn't the end of the story. It's the fire that forges the new one. I went on to expand the Phoenix Room into 2 more cities. Created a podcast called The Second Yes, where women shared their comeback stories. Hosted panels, interviewed experts, gave TED-style talks. But the proudest moment came on the 3rd anniversary of the day I was left at the altar. I stood on the very stage where I was supposed to say, "I do." This time the room was filled with survivors, dreamers, warriors. And I stood tall in front of them, not as someone who had been saved, but as someone who had saved herself. "This stage doesn't belong to heartbreak anymore," I said into the mic. "It belongs to hope." I looked around the room, at the women wiping tears, the girls holding their mothers' hands, and I knew that the story that began in pain had found its purpose. A new kind of vow was spoken that day. To rise again. To rewrite endings. To never let someone else's rejection define your worth. So if you've ever been left, discarded, betrayed, know this. You are not broken. You are becoming. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming unforgettable. If you felt this story speak to you, don't forget to like, share, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories of strength, healing, and ultimate comebacks.